Hi, my name's Phil. I like to come out politics, and in this video I'd like to pick up on a thread I touched upon earlier, but I didn't want to go too much into it to distract from my general report on this week's Prime Minister's questions between Keir Starmer and Ian Blackford and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But in this one, what I want to do is to talk a little bit more in depth about how Starmer seems to have taken a slightly new line against Boris Johnson compared to his earlier exchanges in spring and summer. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So back at the start of summer, when the newly recovered Boris Johnson first faced off against Labour leader Keir Starmer, it was obvious immediately that the Prime Minister had no answer to the carefully structured questioning techniques. In fact, for 2 weeks running, it was savage, absolutely brutal. So within a few weeks, the only way that Boris Johnson could even hang on, even just get through the exchanges, was by grandstanding. Mostly on topics that had nothing whatsoever to do with the questions being asked. Certainly the actual questions were never answered. And then I wondered, if Starmer could ever adapt, if he had to. You know, because his questioning strategy against Johnson was much as I would imagine him as a prosecutor. You know, he was Director of Public Prosecutions, and no doubt his extensive courtroom experience was informing the way he was probing Johnson and catching him out every week. But let's say there were to be a different leader of the Conservatives facing off against him. Could he handle, you know, a more robust opposition leader? And you know, will Starmer be able to adapt to meet a different challenge? You know, in other words, what I was asking is it that Starmer coincidentally has a style that's particularly effective against Boris Johnson, but is maybe not that adaptable? And even then, we wouldn't necessarily find out even if Johnson was succeeded, because if he's succeeded by someone who would also be just as vulnerable to that line of questioning, well, maybe we still wouldn't there. We'd specifically need him to be taken over by someone much more hardworking and intelligent. But I think since summer, we have seen a slightly different line from Starmer. We've seen evidence that he is adapting even against Boris Johnson, because the way Starmer posed his questions before summer was very much like setting traps and springing traps, because some of the questions were not hard-hitting in themselves. They were designed to elicit a response, because as soon as it was becoming clear that Boris Johnson was not going to answer questions, it's like, okay, I'll give you questions you don't mind answering. And the questions that Boris Johnson didn't mind answering were always about brilliant things he was going to do in the future. So Johnson, to get himself out of a little hole, would say something he was going to do, or say something that was going to happen. He would state something on the record. Then, when his statement failed, a week later, a few weeks later, Starmer could spring the trap and come back at him with what he said was going to happen and point out to what had actually happened. Like I said, it could be the next week, it could be the next month, it could be a couple of months later. He'd be able to point out the contradiction between what Johnson said and what was actually happening. And this is the way it went. Each question was either reminding Johnson of something he'd said and going, well, what's happened there then? Or just laying the groundwork for him to be able to do that later on. And it worked well enough, so why change it? I think for one reason is that Boris Johnson was just refusing to answer the questions. Now, many observers will look at that and go, well, you're not answering the question, and there isn't really ever a good reason in such a situation to avoid answering a reasonable question. But there are also those who won't be that sharp and won't see that. They'll just see Boris Johnson standing up, saying a thing confidently that they don't really understand because they're not paying attention. And they'll just think, oh, well, he seemed all right with that. He didn't mind that question. So how do you further pin down a Prime Minister who refuses to answer searching questions? How do you step it up another level? Well, it seems that Starmer has been trying something else. And, you know, it really hit me yesterday. I think, now that I think about it, it was probably been used a bit before as well. But yesterday particularly, there was a different type of question. So Starmer asked a few questions that were just simple, straightforward questions that he absolutely knew Boris Johnson would not answer. And also, they weren't forcing Johnson to make a statement on what he was going to do in the future. So as a trap, it was useless as well. It's not. So he wasn't springing a trap on Johnson, and he wasn't laying one for the future. So a waste of a question, really. I mean, why ask such a question if you know he's not going to answer it, and you can't even get a statement out of him to use against him later on? Is he running out of things to ask? You know, in his desperate attempt to avoid asking questions about Brexit, is he just, you know, having to stick to the same ones? No, because it was quite interesting. I think what he was using was the situation to show the public that the emperor has no clothes. So if you ask the Prime Minister, any Prime Minister, and we're not just talking about this gormless article, a question about something that is for many people abstract, could be the economy or international diplomacy, you know, any sort of political philosophy, that you get away with a non-answer. As a Prime Minister, you can get away with saying something that sounds all right, that isn't really an answer. And because most people don't think about things like that too deeply, barely have an opinion beyond the opinion that their newspaper gives them. And they don't see the connection between it and their daily lives. And that is the crux of it. If it's something that they do not see the connection between their daily lives and it, they're not that bothered. A lot of people are not that bothered, and they won't really pay too much attention to the answer. But if you ask a question about something that affects millions of people's daily lives in a very obviously directly attributable way, then those millions of people will listen to the answer. If you make it a simple, straightforward question that they understand, not a technical question, a simple, straightforward question that anyone can understand, then those same millions of people will expect an answer that they understand. If it's not a technical question, there should not be a technical answer. Millions of people are either in the position or know someone in the position of either needing or having needed a COVID test. So millions of people know what a shambles the system is. They know that. There's no denying that. So when Boris Johnson says that there isn't a problem with test and trace, those millions of people know that this is not true. So the Prime Minister, by saying that, is either clueless or he's lying. Again, when Starmer pointed out that before summer, Boris Johnson said that test and trace would be a game changer, absolutely get on top of this, but that just this week he was saying that it had no bearing whatsoever on the COVID rate, people will have taken notice in a way that they may not have done before it involved them personally. So people will have seen that question, more specifically heard that question, and the nonsensical response. And they'll have asked themselves, why did the Prime Minister talk up the impact of test and trace before it was implemented, but now that it has been implemented, it's supposed to be up and running and, by the way, world beating, why is he now saying that it's irrelevant to the spread of infection? And as I say, these aren't technical questions requiring a technical mind to process. They are simple questions with answers that are clearly going nowhere. Boris Johnson is trying to say that test and trace doesn't have an effect on this second wave that we're seeing now. The reason is because his test and trace is failing. Now that many more people are interested in questions and answers about our COVID response, because it's brought to them much more personally, more people, when they hear a simple, straightforward question about it, will be listening to what Boris Johnson has to say about it. And that's why I think these sorts of questions are appearing now. Maybe it wouldn't have worked before. All Starmer has to do is ask a simple, direct question of the Prime Minister. Doesn't have to be a clever attempt to call him out. Doesn't necessarily even need a response that can be used against him later, though those questions are still in use as well. Just needs to be a question that the public want an answer to. And then Johnson exposes himself by not answering it. And this is a very clever line of attack, because it's a line of attack that Johnson cannot defend himself from by not answering the question, because it's the not answering the question that plays right into Starmer's hands. Starmer is asking the question in a way that he wants Boris Johnson not to answer it, because that is what is exposing him. But then Johnson can't solve the problem going, I'm onto your game, Sonny Jim. Right, I'm going to answer the question. That'll sort you out. because that would be even worse. Because the questions being asked are chosen specifically because they are questions that Johnson has no good answer for. So what does Boris Johnson do against this? If he answers the question, he's sunk. If he doesn't answer the question, he's exposed. What does he do? Well, all he was able to do yesterday was to try to accuse Starmer of making a political issue out of COVID, scoring points, whilst his government was dealing with the situation. But the problem with that is that there are an increasing number of people who can see that the situation isn't being dealt with. We have had public health experts saying yesterday that the government has a very short window to get on top of this second wave, and that the measures that were announced the day before are like an umbrella in a hurricane. Because from the point of view of the public listening to this, the conclusion is simple. We are headed for an absolute perfect storm of a second wave larger than the first, seasonal flu, excessive pressure on an undermined NHS, a public health programme being run by private firms with zero experience of public health, run by a director whose only discernible skill is in being able to ride a horse, and a government totally inept in the face of any challenge. Because it's not like they've made a big mess of a serious issue. They've made a mess of every issue this year. And that can only mean one thing. The proportion of the population who are seeing Boris Johnson for the fraud that he is going to increase, because our testing system is not going to cope. There's going to be much greater demand. We're not going to be able to meet that demand. More and more people will be failed by it. More and more people are going to be looking at the Prime Minister for the simple, direct questions that Keir Starmer is asking and wondering why he's not answering. So that's my take. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.